Floods and droughts. It tends to get some people's attention. I want to acknowledge my collaborators. So Matt Farringer from the Aerospace Corporation. If you don't know what that is, it's a federally funded research and design center, nonprofit research. And then Eric Wood from Princeton University. So in this project, one of the things that we were motivated to explore is the NRC is highlighted in two reports that we're basically reaching a tipping point in our space infrastructure where it potentially could collapse, and that's actually their words, not mine. So the first test that we did in our first initial prac is that we wanted to explore the specific implications of what a collapse or the potential collapse looks like for precipitation, so floods and droughts. And then the next thing is to go from that task, which is basically analyzing what's in the sky, to what could be in the sky. So looking at new architectures, new strategies. How do you make it more economical, sustainable to actually do the monitoring? And so I'll show the results that we have from both those tasks. So why does this matter? From my own perspective, one of the things that we're looking forward to is trying to think through what would the future water cycle kind of experiment look like, or these orbits, or how do we do this? And then secondly is that there's a whole myriad, even though I'm predominantly interested in our sciences and water cycle, some of the insights we have here are general to telecommunication and navigation and a variety of applications. So the first thing is, it seems like a relatively simple question. So you hear a lot about floods and droughts and global risks and climate change. So there's a bit of a paradox, though. At the same time that we're doing a maximum amount of modeling, we actually have the potential for a collapse of our ability to observe precipitation. So these are the 10 satellite systems currently that are observing precipitation from space. These are all beyond design life, some of which, for example, trimmed by more than 14 years. And so one of the questions is this even sufficient? Because what you have here is you have different countries, and even within the same country, you have different agencies, and they each have their own missions. And so one of the things that we wanted to highlight is, what are the implications of that lack of coordination, and where do we fall? So what we did is, in essence, an experiment. What if we start with this, and we call it the full portfolio? If we did an idealized assumption that it was perfectly coordinated, and that visibility from space was data access, which is very much not necessarily true, but that's a very optimal, and in that sense, a very aggressively optimistic perspective, and then look at a reduced portfolio if we lose this. So the first thing that we actually have to do, which may seem obvious or you would think that exists, but it actually doesn't, is set a baseline for exactly how much data do you actually need to do global forecast, and that varies across the globe. And so, in collaboration with the Princeton group, what we ended up doing and what Blue Waters facilitated for us is we did the largest model diagnostic in the history of terrestrial hydrology. So we actually looked at the global terrestrial hydrology. This is a 1-degree grid. On average, that's about 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. And we did 10,000 samples of possible ways that you could actually parameterize the different properties. You have a lot of heterogeneity in land processes, energetics, and things like that. And so actually they had never had the ability to look at that or do a comprehensive diagnostic. That onto itself has actually attracted a lot of attention to this work. And it also turned out that it's a lot harder than we imagined. On average, out of those 10,000 samples, only about 5% of the parameters were behavioral or matched well with the ground observation. What do we do with that? So we've done a virtual experiment. So the first thing that I described is the diagnostic. And you can take this grid as that grid of parameters of how do you parameterize each cell of Earth. And you do that for 10,000 members. You map that through, and then you determine behavior based on how well does it match stream flow, because we're interested in this particular instance in stream forecast and flood forecasting. So when you create these behavioral sets, then we use those to do another type of experiment. What we did is we took the best available representation of current precipitation globally, and then we coarsened it by reducing its frequency, and then we mapped it through that ensemble. And what we're looking for is that point where we're starting to really degrade or not trust the model. So we no longer can do an adequate forecast of flood. So at this point, what that does is that set how much data do you actually need? What's the frequency that you need data in a given cell on Earth to do a reasonable flash flood forecast? And then we can contrast that with the team at Aerospace, how much in an ideal system, if we assume that it's perfectly coordinated across agencies and countries, and that visibility from space is availability of data, is it sufficient? So just to orient you in terms of surface runoff, so this is floods. As you move up this scale, this is worst case gaps, so gaps. And you have a dynamical system, and so if you have random space-time gaps, it really messes up your ability to actually do the forecast. And if you create operational dependencies on the data, it's even worse there. So if you're doing reservoir operations or you're trying to evacuate. So the way that you can view this is the time delay between rainfall data that we need and what we can get. This is this optimistic from space assumption, a full portfolio. So what's the question we're asking? If we pretended like all 10 of those satellites were perfectly coordinated and visibility was actual data, is that enough data? And the answer is no. So what you see here are certain sections where you have brown, where actually in these regions, and it's obviously less important in places like Europe and the United States, where we have a lot of other data. But the challenge is in some of these other areas, first you see gray. There isn't even enough data to do the evaluation. And then in other areas you can see these browns. And so this is that full portfolio, very optimistic set. What happens if we turn off those satellites that are beyond their design life? So this is obviously much, much worse. And at this point, you're missing whole events. You could have very high-intensity floods that you basically don't observe. The other problem with this is it's very complicated nonlinear dynamics. So it's statistical in space and time of when this would occur. It makes it extremely difficult. So one of the things to just think about this is in terms of a trade-off of investment, or what's the consequences of the lack of coordination in this system. Obviously, we'd like to minimize the number of satellites that we have to use, and we also want to minimize our gaps in the data. We can start at the full portfolio, and that's what I showed you. And this is the worst case gap globally. The next thing I showed you is what happens when we lose those 4 satellite systems, so that's a reduced portfolio. So one of the things that we looked at as a systems engineering perspective is, well, what if just using the existing, just supplementing the existing systems, adding additional satellites, what could we do? Well, it's interesting. We could actually use 8 satellites that outperform 10 satellites in every metric. So fewer satellites and better coverage. And what is this actually characteristic of? This is actually capturing that coordination cost. The fact that every agency has its own mission, every country has its own mission, every mission itself is done one at a time. So you could rephrase this as an opportunity for coordination. And this was the primary point that was picked up in the paper where we published this. This actually got a marquee at NSF, so the homepage, which was nice. The funny thing is, in the United States, this got ignored because of the California drought. But it got picked up, so it made the news in Pakistan and in China. And so there was actually a huge amount of international attention on these results, and a fairly positive in the sense that phrasing this, that it does make sense to coordinate this. And actually, another artifact of this is that actually, as part of the Blue Waters and having the data and being able to share this story, I was invited by the board of Earth Sciences in the NRC to give a briefing and talk about, in essence, my talk was data scarcity paradoxes in the era of big data. So, task 1 was looking at what's in the sky and being constrained by what you're currently doing. What if we get creative and we start thinking very differently? And this is where a lot of my group working closely with aerospace and the systems engineering area. It's a pretty nonlinear problem. This is for one satellite. And then you're starting to mix satellites. And so one of the things that we're interested in doing is minimizing the cost to launch and maximizing life. Propellant is expensive and it's difficult. And if you have to actively manage satellites, you're constantly on the ground manipulating them, keeping to mission, that's also extraordinarily expensive. So one of the things that we want to do is that we want to take these nonlinear dynamics and use them to work with us. And we want to think through these different, because there are different coverages, and they conflict in space and time. So you can do one thing in one area, but not necessarily in another. And so what we've developed here is a very powerful and flexible framework where we can create the requirements for these kind of next generation architectures, where you specify what you're trying to do in the system, you move through, you create an actual multi-objective space where you can look at the trade-offs, for example this, in the actual architectures that you're contemplating. And just to orient you here, you want to minimize coverage deficit, you want to minimize mission cost, and you'd like a long lifespan. So ideally, you'd like to be down here with the cone up. The gray and the colored are two different architectures, and you can start to see the analysis where you're looking at this. This seems pretty easy. Well, when we started this idea of passive control, or getting into the idea of reducing propellant, when you move from the classical way that it's done and you start accounting for larger and more expensive numerics to evaluate new architectures, it gets very expensive very fast. So the design simulations move from the simple first test case that I showed you, minutes per evaluation, to where what I'm about to show you, if we wouldn't have done a lot of numerical work and worked with aerospace, it would have taken 2 weeks per design evaluation. So we had to parallelize that code and then work that into our parallel solver. What do we have here? To get those multi-objective trade-offs, we actually have scaled a solver, and that's been published. This is actually the largest scaling study of its kind in this area as well. One of the interesting things is that the solver itself is a complex dynamical system. It actually adapts itself as it solves the problem, which consequently, when you combine that complexity with the complexity of the architecture of blue waters, it gets a bit overwhelming. You could get into an enumerative explosion. So what we ended up doing is we created a discrete event simulation of our algorithm itself, where we could have predictive capability to actually predict what configuration of our algorithm would solve this scalably on blue waters. And it also gives us a theoretical way to go beyond the current experiment. So our blue waters scaling experiment, we were very strong in this area. And what we can see is, as we move out to more complex cases, is that we can do a lot in a minimum amount of wall clock. So why do we care about this? So if we move away from the classical assumptions and start thinking about it, and one of the things that we're poking at is, what if you launch these vehicles or these satellites out of the high traffic zone, higher elevation? So there's two things that happen. On the good side is you're actually outside of that band of high traffic in space. On the bad side is the higher you go, the more these other kinds of perturbations. For example, the fact that the Earth isn't actually a sphere, or you can have tidal effects, you can have drag, you can have all these things, and they start to degrade the system. So our thought process here is, one, it's numerically non-trivial to account for these. And then two is, what if we actually start to use these to our advantage, to where we launch the vehicles into the right initial condition, where these anomalies actually self-correct the satellite, so passive control. So instead of having someone on the ground actually correcting it, have some predictive skill to where it's self-correcting. So to benchmark that idea, we compared it across a lot of configurations. So this is one of many. This was actually presented in Space 2014, and we're preparing another paper for 2015. But in essence, these are the kinds of, each of these points in this trade-off space represents a particular configuration of a possible satellite constellation. And what we're specifically looking for is that we want to use minimum propellant, which would be blue. We want to have high elevations, and we want to have high data coverage. So you want to move to this area. So what is the best that you could do in terms of the theoretical baseline? Actually, DRAME has a patented 4 satellites. So this is the minimum number of satellites that provide global coverage that's ever been, to this date, shown. Now, DRAME used some analytics to derive the performance. Why did no one ever build the DRAME system? Because in this, you actually would want this whole diagram to sustain global coverage. If you account for perturbations, the actual DRAME system would degrade in its performance by 60% relatively quickly. And so if you launch these 4 satellites up, you don't actually get the advertised performance. So it's never been built, but that being said, it is the best analytic result. So one of our results actually compares favorably. So this is a 4 satellite result out of our passive control results. This is a minimum amount of propellant, and what it basically says is less than 60 minutes of coverage gaps over the whole Earth over a 10-year lifespan, and a dramatic reduction in the propellant cost. The next interesting question is, how does this affect the economics of launch vehicles and accessibility? You start now thinking about creating new opportunities for parties to have access to space observations that would be economically unviable. So in this, it's interesting, it's challenging. One of the things that we're still looking at on a technical level is there is still some small level of gap here. And what we've actually discovered is that we can actually design and put that in a latitude and predict exactly where it will occur. And so you can actually have people tailor where that gap is going to be based on a mission. The intent is to then think about this for future Earth science and specifically terrestrial science applications. So next steps for our team, one of the things that we discovered in doing the diagnostics for the global hydrology is actually that there were strong challenges within the soil representation on Earth. And so some coordination with our team and some folks in Australia. One of the products that we will end up generating is this new Polaris data set, which is actually going to be, it's a machine learning combination of covariates, so land covers, climate, digital elevation, which is actually augmenting and enhancing our ability to coverage this. There's already been some interest from the soil services, both in the US and abroad for this. And that's going to go into a next generation hydrology model. So the hydrology model that we did the preliminary tests, our diagnostics showed that it had some weaknesses and that it was definitely resolution limited in our ability to capture processes. So we are in the process, the Princeton team is leading this, where you can actually use that classifier system and then you can create these hydrologic response units. What's the implication of this is that these types of results that you're getting would have required 700,000 grid points, but through the new framework that we're using, that reduces down to 393 hydrologic response units, where you can actually back map to the high resolution result. And it allows us to use a mix of OpenMP and MPI, and it sets a new baseline for the way that we could scale. And our intent here is to go 30 meters for the United States and 100 meters for the whole globe, which would be the largest experiment of its kind. So, and we hope we can do that in a renewal. So with that, that's it.
Are there any questions from the audience? Oh.
Pieces of the HDF technology. Are you guys, what do you guys, could you tell us a little bit more about your storage and I/O?
So actually, and one of the things I should highlight is a giant thank you to the Blue Waters program, because the model diagnostic took 1.5 petabytes of output processing. So we're using NetCDF with the latest HDF in it. Otherwise, this would have not been feasible for us. And so that's what we're currently doing. And then the other questions that we're exploring is localization of that data, kind of the node where we start doing the models and the ensembles and thinking through that.
Okay.
And so, and actually, we used a Python processing of NetCDF on Blue Waters.
Interesting. Okay. I'd probably follow up with you after offline.